Our next speaker is Rene de Resta, an expert on computational propaganda. She's a researcher at Stanford's Internet Observatory and a fellow on disinformation at Mozilla. She was also one of the researchers on the recent report about Russia's manipulation operations in 6 African countries. Here's Rene de Resta.
Hello. All right. You guys hear me okay? Here we go. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking a little more about policy than about Russian spy stuff. But we can save that for the Q&A if we want to. The work that I do at Stanford, so we have the Stanford Internet Observatory. It's headed by Alex Stamos, who used to be Facebook's chief security officer. I'm the research manager. So I manage a team of folks who are working on various projects related, some regionally, some about particular types of manipulation. We are looking at 3 broad buckets of work. So the first is kind of forensic analysis. So on Tuesday of last week, we actually put out a paper on GRU activities targeting a range of countries around the world from 2014 to 2019. That was a forensic research operation. Then Rachel mentioned the Africa stuff. That was put out 2 weeks prior. That was an unexpected find. That was related to Yevgeny Prigozhin, who runs the Internet Research Agency, also runs an entity called Wagner Group. And we looked at, alongside Facebook actually, a very proactive investigation into pages that were still live and still producing. So not forensic, proactive detection. And then the third bucket is how do we take what we see in the course of this research and think about policy recommendations? How do we think about, structurally speaking, what is it about the internet that enables these types of operations? How do we think about the internet as dual-use technology, particularly social platforms as dual-use technology, meaning that the platforms are being used in precisely the way they are designed to be used, but there's an extremely negative spin. We call it kind of malign content, malign actors, malign intent, whereby the same type of features that are designed to facilitate activism or facilitate engagement or facilitate peer-to-peer contact can be manipulated and misused in a certain way. And so how do we think about ways in which you can tailor interventions or regulation without going after the system in its entirety? Hope that made sense. So one of the things that we've tried to do is understand a taxonomy for the type of manipulation. So there's a lot of, particularly in the era of the techlash, a lot of beliefs that many, many things are wrong on the internet. And so in the context of disinformation specifically, how do we think about the notion of information disorder and what the various types are? And one of the reasons for doing this is because these 4 things are actually quite different in terms of not so much execution, but in terms of intent. And it is really problematic when you speak in terms of intent because that is a very, very hard thing to quantify. So misinformation is information that is just wrong. And usually when we use the term misinformation, we're referring to something that's wrong, but oftentimes the dissemination of the wrong thing is inadvertent. So you can think about this. I'm probably a little older than some of you, but the like forwarded emails you used to get from your mom or your grandma, like telling you that like light bulbs caused cancer and stuff like that. So that was not a thing that, the people who were sharing that were doing that out of like a genuine desire to be helpful, a genuine desire to alert people to something that they should know to improve their daily lives. Now the fact that a lot of it was false or based on kind of hoax, that was sort of ancillary to if we looked at it, it was the spread of wrong information on the internet. So for disinformation, the prevailing framework right now is that there is an intent to influence and an intent to deceive. And so we look, you can construct little kind of 2x2s around influence and deception and where that intent lies, but disinformation kind of falls in that quadrant of intent to influence and intent to deceive. It's interestingly not always wrong, and this is where we get to the idea of propaganda. So propaganda is a thing that preceded the internet by centuries. Propaganda, roughly defined, is information with an agenda. So it's information that is not necessarily true, not necessarily false, but presented with an inflection to have an appeal, an emotional resonance that speaks to the audience that it's targeting. Sometimes that's in the era of, you've probably all seen propaganda posters from old wars. So to kind of create a sense of unity, a shared opposition to the opponent, particular points of view about a war. And so this is the kind of propaganda sometimes produced by governments, sometimes produced by regular people, by activists. It's really just information with an agenda inflected in a particular way. Propaganda becomes a tool in disinformation campaigns. And that's because it takes information, there's usually some grain of truth to it, but the way that it is put out, this is where when we talk about Russia in particular, you see entities that are themselves fake, sort of front organizations, putting out particular types of propaganda where that message would be perfectly legitimate if it came from an authentic, in this case, American voice, but when it's a piece of propaganda that's pushed by a Russian troll in St. Petersburg, it is no longer what we consider authentic. So we have a lot of challenges around authenticity and around intent when we describe this problem, and this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to think about regulation. The canonical example for this sort of intersection of propaganda and disinformation would be the Texas secessionist campaign that the Internet Research Agency ran. There are real Texas secessionists. There are people in Texas who hold that point of view. It is a perfectly legitimate political point of view to have. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it is still a point of view on the spectrum of ideas that we are allowed to have and express as Americans. When a Russian troll creates a page pretending to be a Texas secessionist, then we get into a whole other world of really weird distinctions around what is an authentic Texas secessionist, where is that line that we're going to draw if I, an ex-New Yorker, suddenly run a Texas secessionist page, but I'm still an American, am I an authentic Texas secessionist? So this is where the more that you delve down into what happens and how it's executed, the more you realize the lines that are being drawn that are not clear, bright lines, but are really much more in the realm of, when the Russians do it, it is demonstrably false and demonstrably malign. It is a manipulation of who the voice of the message is. But then there's this whole spectrum around who is an authentic voice for that message, and how should social platforms think about who is allowed to run a page like that. Fake news used to have meaning. It used to refer to demonstrably false news, and that was where, again, it had an interesting intersection with misinformation and disinformation, because unlike propaganda, which oftentimes is true and just inflected in a particular way, fake news in the original sense of the term really referred to things like Pope endorses Donald Trump or Megyn Kelly fired from Fox, which were two stories that trended on Facebook, achieving millions of views during the 2015 this was in 2016, the 2016 portion of the presidential campaign. So the idea of information that was created either by hyper-partisan American sites, so again, when we get at that idea of what is an authentic voice, that's real American media that is putting out that story. And then sometimes it was actually being run for economic reasons by Macedonian spammers who just wanted people to click through so that they could monetize the ad load on the website. So again, that idea of how do we think about voice, about content, and about dissemination patterns. And when we do this kind of research, we're always looking at the intersection of the three. You never want to focus solely on what is the content, because again, the Texas secessionist example shows that something can be identically produced by two separate actors. So we're looking at what is the actor, and then we look at what is the dissemination pattern. And by that I mean you can have information that is itself legitimate, put out by a legitimate voice, but if they use things like attempts to game an algorithm, an army of bots, paid or fraudulent engagement, then there's a degree of fraud around the dissemination of the content. So again, the actor is real, the content is real, the dissemination is malign. And so we're always looking at these sorts of three axes to try to understand what we're dealing with for any of these types of campaigns. So the question becomes, how did we get here? So I would say when I think about disinformation, there are sort of three kind of core facets of the information ecosystem that really do more than anything else to enable intent to influence and intent to deceive. The first is the audience consolidation. And that's because these are side effects of just how the internet ecosystem grew. So this was not, of course, executed with an intent to create systems that perpetuate harm. This is just the way that social platforms are better when more people are on them. You have a better experience with your friends. So you do see this audience consolidation really just a function of how people use the system, how people engage on it. But what it also does is it gives propagandists kind of a ready standing audience, where as we've seen with large disinformation campaigns, they really focus their energy on sort of the three big platforms, and then they do some things on the ancillary ones on the side, but the majority of the lift, the majority of the spread comes from dissemination on three platforms. Personalized targeting. This is where, again, this is both in relation to ads, but also in relation to the platform facilitating curation in response to what it knows about you. So with something like the Internet Research Agency, some of the operations that they ran started with ads, but once they had pushed ads to people who were in their target audience demographic, a lot of the facilitation of audience growth came from organic social sharing. And that's because what they do is when you share something that you like on Facebook, some percentage of your friends or followers will see it. And that's a function of the platform deciding who is most likely to enjoy that content, to resonate with that content, and so it pushes it out. So this is where the idea of targeting ensures that the propaganda is seen by the people most likely to be receptive to it. That's very distinct from our old understanding of propaganda, which was put out under kind of a consolidated media ecosystem, where it was much less targeted at the people who were most likely to become activated activists who were going to continue to share it. And then the gameable algorithms is what I was describing on the dissemination front. And that's where if you can make something trend, you can really create the perception that it's true. So what you see is entities working hard to game the algorithm such that they get that distribution and that lift. And one of the reasons for that is actually to then get out of social platforms and really reach mainstream media. And this is a thing that we saw that we wrote about in our GRU paper recently, which is that it is possible in something like the case of DC Leaks for the social operation, the social sharing, the initial creating a Facebook page for DC Leaks and posting content. DC Leaks was the hacked DNC emails. Completely failed. They got almost no lift from their own social pages. But what you see is they launder it through entities like WikiLeaks, which have huge followings on Twitter. There's a lot of sharing. Then you see the Internet Research Agency trolls come in, use amplification to kind of perpetuate certain hashtags that they pull out, the most sensational hashtags, things like spirit cooking. They find the most conspiratorial things, they make them trend on Twitter, and we do see mainstream press begin to cover what is spirit cooking. And this is how you make something into a national news story at that point. Another canonical example of this is the conspiracy theory that it was not Russia that hacked the DNC. It was a leak by a staffer who was murdered named Seth Rich. There's a concerted campaign, hashtag his name is Seth Rich, in which entities begin to perpetuate the idea that this wasn't Russia at all, that was a vast conspiracy theory, and you start to see Russian trolls participate in this hashtag. You see it on 4chan, and then you start to see 2 weeks later, Hannity is presenting on Fox News that it wasn't Russia, it was really this murdered staffer who was a Bernie supporter, and he was offed by Hillary Clinton. And so that is how, again, if you're the purpose of gaming the algorithm is not solely to get the trend, it's actually to reach the mainstream coverage, because if something is trending, someone is going to write about it. So that, roughly speaking, is the kind of state of play, the process by which it happens, and now we have to think about what we do about it. So this is where we get at the challenge of there are a lot of legitimate equities with hard trade-offs here. So when we think about regulation, and I'm going to go into some of these trade-offs as we go, I'm going to start by walking through the buckets that regulation in response to disinformation is taking. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit of how this exists actually in conflict You can't have all of the things all at once. And so some of the things that we have done to improve privacy actually hurt the ability of security researchers to find these operations. So really recognizing that there is no magic bullet here. There is nothing that is going to solve the problem. And we have to be thinking a lot more carefully and in a much more nuanced way about what our options are and where we can actually make an impact. So for disinformation, one of the areas that's really gotten a lot of attention is the national security aspect of this. So independent of the dual use aspect of social platforms, is there a regulatory environment that we can create that targets the bad actors? How do we think about deterrence? How do we think about imposing costs on adversaries? How do you convey to Russia that this is not an acceptable thing to be doing in the 2020 election? So I'm going to walk through a couple of the kind of big overarching pieces of legislation. I'm going to spend some time going a little bit deeper into one of these because I feel like it really gets at the challenges of using deterrence in national security as the lens through which we view this. But there's presently, I would say, about 6 or 7 bills right now. Of course, China and Russia are treated separately. China, you see a lot more stuff related to Huawei, 5G, and some of the technological aspects of it because there was no Chinese social media interference in the US election. Russia, much more focused on aspects related specifically to this particular operation. One thing, I don't know how many of you spend a lot of time reading bills. A lot of times they give them some long name because it has a cute acronym, and so we have a couple of them related to Russia right now. There's the Defending American Security from Kremlin Aggression Act of 2019. There's the No Russia in G7 Act. But then the one that I'm going to just walk through a little bit right now is the Countering Russian Influence Through Interagency Coordination and Leadership Act, which spells critical. This is the critical act. So this is why I'm reading from my notes through some of this because I can only keep so many things in your head at once. Basically for this, the reason for this is that Congress found Russia participated in malign influence tactics to influence activity in the US, Europe, and NATO, including but not limited to disinformation campaigns, which necessitates a US government response. So the idea is that we need to create some sort of commission to investigate this. So a lot of times the legislation that you'll see begins with, it's not legislation that will do a thing, it is legislation that will set up a committee to later do a thing, and so that's where we are here. Sorry, let me just actually move this on my laptop really quickly so I can, there we go, all right, now I can see my notes a little bit better. Okay, so this is to create a commission to counter global malign influence, which includes, so they do specify, even though I think Russia is in the name, this is looking at Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, seeking to undermine US and its allies. And it goes through really the ask here is to create a commission to study tools of malign influence, which include disinformation, illicit finance, political influence, and corruption, and then to come up with short and long-term methodology and metrics to monitor the effectiveness of efforts to counter malign influence. And of course, as these things do, there's a budget, $6 million for this commission, and then the commission will terminate 6 months after the submission. So one of the challenges here is really it's the recognition that something is wrong. They want to set up metrics. One of the challenges is that, as we have seen with the work that myself and my teams have been doing, what the Internet Research Agency did and the metrics and means that we evaluate it are we're looking backwards largely at what happened in 2015, 2016, and so metrics and measurements really turns into something like Facebook likes and Twitter shares. That's not a That's the idea. We've actually moved away from this even in just the last 2.5 years that I've been working on this particular actor. The GRU operation is a failure if you use the same metrics that the Internet Research that you would use to evaluate the Internet Research Agency operation. But the GRU operation became national news because every time they dropped a new tranche of documents, it was on national news. So what are the metrics and measurements that you establish for looking at something like that versus looking at the Internet Research Agency as a social media first entity? And then there's the other piece of it, one of the things we write about at Stanford, which is entities like RT and Sputnik. So state-sponsored propaganda propagandist media that commands audiences of millions. They just have millions of followers on YouTube and elsewhere. So again, the question becomes, what are the metrics? What are the means by which we do this? So ultimately the bill sets up a commission, and then the commissioners have to kind of struggle with answering those questions for a while, and then maybe somewhere down the line we get something that's more deterrence focused. The China one is interesting. This one actually doesn't have a cute acronym. It's just the Countering the Chinese Government and Communist Operations Act. CCGCO. No, so that that directs the Department of State to devise a long-term strategy to counter the Chinese government's political influence operations and seeks to increase awareness of Chinese campaigns and help other countries develop the capacity to counter them. This is also a very interesting one because, again, it is not necessarily operations that are being carried out on social platforms. China has a phenomenally robust state media ecosystem, much like RT or Sputnik. Those sorts of entities are there. They have phenomenally large followings on Facebook, which is fascinating because Facebook technically does not operate in China, but it does allow Chinese government entities and state media to run Facebook pages and to run ad campaigns targeting English language users worldwide so that people can, in fact, follow Chinese state media on Facebook. And this is it's an interesting kind of, I think, quandary. A lot of, there's things like FARA and declaring that an entity is state-sponsored media and requiring that they put up a disclaimer that YouTube does this now with RT. I don't know to what extent Facebook is doing it with the Chinese media ecosystem. I'd have to go and look. But it is, how do you communicate to people that they are reading official state media? And then how do you think about, I think BBC gets a flag on YouTube also because BBC is state-funded media, PBS, other entities in the US, Voice of America. So how do we, we have like this kind of crude ability to slap a disclaimer on it under the legal ecosystem that we operate under now. Should we be expanding that? Should we be thinking about it differently? Should it be more niche, more tailored at this point? And these are topics of conversation as we think about national security and the overt kind of persistent press apparatus, as opposed to things like subversive entities like fake Texas secessionists. So you can run a propaganda operation that is actually extremely upfront. It's called white propaganda, and that's the RT and Sputnik, things where you know that you're engaging with a state media operation, versus the sort of subversive black propaganda of malign influence campaigns with fake pages and things. So there's efforts to look at both. Besides national security and thinking about deterrence and thinking about what kind of deterrence frameworks are available to us in the context of nation states, there's election security. So this is where we have the Stopping Harmful Interference in Elections for a Lasting Democracy Act, which is SHIELD, and then the Defending Elections Against Trolls from Enemy Regimes Act, which is DETER. And then there's the Election Security Act of 2019, which I'm like, that's just a nice, simple name. There's the Firewall Act, Deceptive Practices and Voter Intimidation Prevention Act. This is where not all of these focus on nation states, right? There is a recognition that there's a slide I sometimes use when I focus more on how disinformation campaigns work that goes through actors, and that's state actors are one entity. They're actually the brightest line, but then you have things like spammers, terrorist organizations are also an extremely bright line. But then you get into spammers and economic motivations, and then you get into also domestic ideologues who can actually do quite a lot of, who can run effectively the same strategy. But when they're not foreign actors, you do get into this question of, we have freedom of expression commitments here, and so for someone to run these pages, there is nothing remotely illegal about it. It's just seen as free expression. So when we think about election security, how do we think about updating our ideas about things like voter suppression for communications, persuasive communications in the social media internet age? The SHIELD bill does in fact incorporate this element of foreign interference in particular. It's to report election interference from foreign entities, but the other things that it does besides that is it applies existing campaign advertising requirements to online advertisements. I'm going to talk about ads actually separately, but one of the things that's interesting is some of these bills span multiple entities where they're saying, okay, for this SHIELD Act, election security has this national security component, so we're going to have this requirement that if Russia reaches out to you with material about your opponent, you're supposed to disclose that, which my understanding was that you were already supposed to disclose that, but maybe that's a norm and not a law, and now we're moving into making that a law. But this is where we have so it applies to existing campaign advertising requirements for online advertisements as well, and then generally limits political spending and election interference by foreign entities. One of the really big takeaways in meetings with representatives who are involved in authoring these bills, first, there are huge definitional challenges, which I'll get to a little bit later when we talk about the ones that go after tech specifically. But passing legislation on election security, it really is a huge partisan football. And that's because a large part, unfortunately, of the Republican Party still sees any legislation passed now as a referendum on the 2016 election and the legitimacy of the 2016 election, and so there's this resistance to doing some things that one would think are actually quite common sense, but there's a belief that it reflects badly on 2016, so instead of being forward-looking, we're still stuck in this imbroglio around that. That's been one of the interesting, frustrating things about my own work too, which is the more we put out, the better an understanding we have of what happened in 2016, the more there are other entities to point to and things that we can do or fix or adjust. But there's this resistance where the work is really turned into a partisan football because you're saying that even if there is, separating collusion from interference has been a really significant challenge, unfortunately, and it's really impacting, I think, our ability to pass good legislation. So again, in keeping with the theme of ads, Honest Ads Act was really the first one to come down on this, and Honest Ads Act appeared in 2017. And that was in part a response to the recognition that there had been a lot of ads that were run on Facebook where who ran them was not disclosed, which did provide a loophole for state actors to run them. And so there was an idea that we should create these transparency frameworks, ensuring that now when you see a Facebook ad, you can click in and you can see who is running the ad. You can click in and you can see transparency around how long the ad is run for, what other things they have run, how much they spent, who they targeted. So Facebook has created this library. Now, interestingly, the Honest Ads Act is actually an example of the legislation being introduced and the platform company trying to get ahead of it. So there's a credible threat of regulation, which means that credible threat of regulation is a very political science policy kind of phrase, but it usually means the introduction of the act, the introduction of the bill, inspires the target of the bill to take steps to get ahead of it so they can say, see, we did this voluntarily, we don't need your version of it because your version of it comes with fines and penalization for violating the law, whereas we're just going to try to deliver the things, the crux, most of the things that you're asking for in the law voluntarily in hopes that the law doesn't pass because people will say, see, we don't really need it. They've already gone ahead and done this. So there's an interesting dynamic there. At the same time, in the U.S. today, because it is almost impossible to get anything passed, and this talk is very U.S. focused, there is that, sometimes the motion in that direction gets us part of the way there, but because it is undertaken voluntarily, that means they can also choose not to do it anymore and there's no consequences. And so one of the challenges with regulation is, in our environment, it is really hard to get regulation passed. So when Facebook took those steps, I actually felt that was actually quite a positive step forward. But the problem is there is no obligation to ensure that it continues. And so this is where when we talk about regulation, a lot of it is not only getting the specific changes that we want to see, it's also creating a responsibility framework where somebody is responsible for ensuring that these rules continue to be implemented. So with this particular one, the bill addresses the prominent role social media platforms play in access to information during elections and the increase in digital advertising, and it aims to enhance transparency and accountability. Those are the two words that we're going to keep returning back to for online political advertisements by requiring those who purchase and publish such ads to disclose information about the advertisements to the public. So this, by the way, after I agreed, after I said I would do this talk, and then before I got here today, so October 22nd, Senate Republicans actually blocked the Honest Ads Act. So this is an act that has been in progress, this was a thought that we would achieve some positive outcome, but so this one is now blocked as well. One of the really interesting things with regard to Facebook and ads, and this is kind of niche, but I think still interesting, they used to self-regulate. They had a decree from the Federal Election Commission. Back in the olden days of Facebook, you might remember, before ads became in-stream, where they looked identical to organic posts, ads on Facebook were those little postage stamp things on the right-hand side of your feed. And there is a particular, I didn't write it in my notes, so I don't remember the number now I wrote, but there is a finding that says if you produce political ads on a framework, like in a form factor that would make disclosure impossible or like odious, you are not obligated by the same disclosure requirements. So like you don't have to print on a pencil all of the disclosures if your campaign is handing out a pencil. And so, and the other area where this applies, funny enough, is skywriting. So you don't. So Facebook ads for a while were actually regulated, fell under the same rule that said that the tiny postage stamp thing was a form factor similar to skywriting and pencils, and so they actually Facebook in, I believe it was 2017, it might have been early 2018, decided to step back from the finding under that rule voluntarily. And has begun putting those disclosures out. One of the things that's been really interesting, again, that was more of a self-regulatory kind of action, and I'll touch on that briefly later, but this is where you start to see I'm trying to think of the best way to put this is, they went and they sort of like undertook this process. Part of the actual verification is the challenge, and so I'll put this out here to this audience in particular. One of the things that they did was they began verifying identity. So I'm verified to run Facebook ads. I manage a pro-vaccination page. Nominally, I really don't do very much with it anymore, but vaccines are a political issue ad under the terms that Facebook set. Because again, when you have to get into like what is a political ad? Is it an ad for a candidate? Is it an ad for a politician, for a policy, for an issue? And so Facebook chose to take a very broad definition of that. So vaccines were actually included in that, and so I went and got myself verified. And so you upload a photograph of your ID, and then they send you a card in the mail, and you type in the number on the card into the verification screen, and that's how they are verifying who's allowed to run Facebook ads. So that was done in part to try to minimize fraud and ensure that people who were running ads were who they said they were. But that actually triggered a huge firestorm because there was a concern that undocumented people then wouldn't get to run ads. So even when you do create these sorts of rules and frameworks, there's always going to be some entity that is unhappy with some particular facet of it. And when I say like very legitimate equities and a lot of hard decisions, this is what I mean. There's a lot of, even independent of the actual legal side of the regulation, just in terms of the policies that people are putting forward, how do you, where do you fall on that side of balance? Do you want more people to verify? Does that verification create sufficiently additional security, recognizing that some small percentage of people are not going to have the documents necessary to be incorporated into the advertising framework. Media literacy, so this is efforts to improve education. There's a lot of talk about, other countries frankly do this a lot better than we do. People are much more aware of what propaganda looks like. There's a recognition that you as a consumer of news and media have to be educated in a particular way. You might all remember, I think, learning what is a source and what is not a source when you write your reports for college. Like, I was definitely not allowed to cite Wikipedia, I don't know. Which is funny because Wikipedia is now the thing that other platforms use as the source, right? And so there is like a real, where do we as a society fall on how to think about media literacy education. But there is introduced, actually just a couple of weeks ago, the Digital Citizenship and Media Literacy Act. That is not an acronym. And it recognizes that people in the US rely on social, mass, and digital media to make decisions, and that threats such as foreign governments are using information warfare to influence democracies. So the bill requires the Secretary of Education to establish a program that promotes digital literacy by awarding grants to eligible entities who will then carry out the mission. So this again is the bill effectively creates this framework by which the Secretary of Education can work with local and community organizations and others to create media literacy frameworks to help educate people. One of the reasons for this is that it's actually pretty consistently shown that it is older people who are much more likely to share disinformation and misinformation. And so it's not just the education that you get as like a young kid in school in 2019. It's actually how do you reach people who came of age far earlier than the digital revolution and don't necessarily, and regularly, much more regularly fall prey to this kind of stuff. Data protection. This is another really interesting one. The newest version of this, I think, is the Filter Bubble Transparency Act. And that's bipartisan. So that's Senator Thune, Senator Warner, Blumenthal, Blackburn. And that requires internet platforms to give users the option to engage with the platforms without having algorithms on the platform that are driven by user-specific data. So if you remember my sort of three things like massive audience consolidation, precision targeting, and gameable algorithms, this one goes after all three by saying the bill applies to companies that make more than 50 million annually and collect data from more than 1 million individuals. So it is recognizing one of the real challenges with this stuff is like where is your floor? And if there's a bill requiring like content to come down or something like that, and I run a blog and somebody leaves a comment, and you don't want to treat small tech the same way you treat big tech in terms of both resourcing and also reach, and the recognition that one disinformation comment from a Russian troll on a blog that nobody reads is not the same thing as a concerted campaign on a platform with billions of users that has algorithmic amplification. And so we are trying to think about, as we get into the more tech-focused or data-focused sides of this, a recognition that scale actually matters quite a bit. But there is some interesting things related to this, and for folks who are in in tech, definitely encourage you to go read this one, because it is really interesting in that what it goes after is the idea of opaque algorithms. And if you're a software engineer or if you've ever worked in tech, you think like, well, literally any algorithm that you write that is not made apparent to a user who is not going to be able to read it on any platform, anywhere, is an opaque algorithm. So the question, when I talk about definitions, like definitions of what is a bot, what is automation, what is curation, what is amplification, how do we think about, for those of us, like when you produce the technical product, that there are certain things that become when people say bot, colloquially mean they think of automated Twitter accounts. They're not thinking about chatbots. They're not thinking about voice. They're not thinking about any type of automated engagement that you have with a thing that appears in some way to behave like a human. With this, we have the idea of opaque algorithms. This is specifically saying that they are concerned about algorithms that make inferences based on user-specific data and then show content. So this is getting at the idea of the platforms that know a lot about you and then serve you content in response to that. They are requiring or asking that there is a option for users to be able to switch to non-opaque algorithms. The example that I've seen written is like you search for a pizza place on Google, and if Google returns results related to where you are, that's an algorithm that is drawing on data that it has about you. But if it just returns pizza place, then it's not, which so I'm sure you can see how that would be absolutely a complete waste of time, like the entire, So the idea is, so there's, it's interesting, it's like a work in progress, I think, but it is really hard because the frustration for people, like, I think a recognition that, yes, there are things that are really bad that happen, but also that the challenge of how do you narrowly tailor something like that, recognizing that there is such we are all at this point so accustomed to that, to having results, like result relevance, be determined in part based on who we are or where we are. Even moving to a reverse chronological feed, which is one thing that they're suggesting, rather than the feed being pushed according to the algorithm's ranking of what you might like to see. There's an idea that the platform should have an option for you to toggle to reverse chronological view. I wonder sometimes about how many people actually want that. I think the reason that we moved to a non-reverse chronological view was that it is demonstrably better. These were very carefully A/B tested things that led to the determination that reverse chronological feed was just not the best experience of the web. And so the idea that we're kind of regulating, regulating the option that people have, that it's just not clear to me that this produces any kind of demonstrable effect on the actual problems. And that, I think, is one of the key challenges as we talk about regulation in the pipeline right now. So I just want to make sure I leave time for questions, so I'll just kind of go through the rest of these. Malign technology. So this is where you start to see deepfakes and bots. This is another area where, unfortunately, the idea is, like, the intent is very good. The idea that deepfakes are deeply harmful, the idea is that bots can be deeply harmful. Again, when it gets down into what is a deepfake, what is a bot, we have a lot more challenges around what this is actually going to apply to. And that, I think, there's you started to see, actually, this is another interesting angle, recognizing that the federal legislation is largely not going anywhere because of partisan problems. You have started to see states come down on this. And so California, Gavin Newsom signed a bill into law, AB 730, known as the anti-deepfake bill. And this is related to, it really kind of places responsibility for producers and users to report the deepfakes. There's a very large burden of proof. It's, I think, within 60 days of an election, so there's a, kind of, you can put out deepfakes otherwise, but 60 days before an election, no. The bot bill was the same kind of thing. It was, it said that if you were running a malicious bot, you were responsible for disclosing that it was a bot, which was, so it's a view of human nature that's divergent from mine. So. But this is the real challenge, though, which is these things are constantly evolving, and the technology is constantly changing, and the mechanisms where the technology appears is constantly changing. And so this is where self-regulation is a thing that a lot of people don't like because it doesn't create the oversight framework. And at the same time, I think, unfortunately, most of the changes that we've seen come down in tech have been a result of public pressure, pushing for self-regulatory moves that they've taken largely to avoid regulation, but also to try to regain some of the lost trust and brand impact that the last few years have had. And with something like emerging technology in particular, or feature changes, I don't believe that you can regulate at a feature level. And so I believe that the question is really, how do you create accountability for the industry as a whole without delving into, the sort of niche frameworks around what is a deepfake, what is a bot, which are going to change when features change, or change when new platforms emerge, or change as other things get popular. And so I don't think that we're necessarily doing the best job with regulating on a feature level. One area where self-regulation has manifested in the industry is actually specifically around terrorism. There is an entity called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And it's not only big tech, it's also medium tech. One of the things that it does is it hashes terrorist content and then shares it out with partners. An interesting example of ways in which that information sharing model is doing more to get that kind of content taken down by having other platforms opt in to the hashes and the information sharing that GIFCT is doing. GIFCT in turn works with governments and security organizations as well to try to ensure that there's appropriate information sharing. And there's movements towards creating what are called ISACs, information sharing advisory councils, that are working on creating more sustained regular frameworks that are bigger than terrorism, that have more, that recognize that there are other problems on the internet besides terrorism, and trying to say, okay, well, the frameworks that we've come up with for combating terrorism or for combating child exploitation maybe can be put to use to looking at disinformation and the recognition that disinformation is an ecosystem level problem. Every time a new feature emerges, something has to, something changes. The adversaries evolve, and so you're not going to be able to stop disinformation by requiring that platforms go and catch it. And so there's I didn't realize this was an animation. This is Alex's slide, not mine. Let's see how this goes. So I like this slide, actually. I saw him give the talk before I started working with him, and actually just thought that this was like a good way of explaining it. When we talk about the equities, when you move in particular directions and you are saying, like, we want to balance all of these things, what you realize is that minimal data collection sometimes conflicts with anti-harassment, right? That when you look at anonymity versus trustworthy information, if you want a platform to surface trustworthy information, it is very hard to do if you're surfacing anonymous speech, because that is where you get into the subversive Russian Texas secessionists, right? When you're looking at something that is censorship resistant but also harassment free, you see again that balance come in. If you are trying to preserve freedom of expression and speech but also create a harassment free environment and strong community standards, which of those things are you willing to give up? And so in the self-regulatory space, also in the regulatory space, there's the recognition that you don't get to have all of these things all of the time. When we talk about privacy and security in particular, some of the changes made in response to Cambridge Analytica were that Facebook really clamped down on its API, right? So comment API, groups API. Instagram is my favorite example of this. If you have a public Instagram account, I can see your followers, and I can see who you're following. I can click it, and I can see it. And yet, there's no way for me to download that. There's no way for me to just get that information. So I literally have to click into the button and then either come up with some convoluted, go into the console and try to copy paste, or literally sit there and type it into a spreadsheet, which is absolutely ludicrous. And so when I'm looking at networks that I know that have a substantially high degree of likelihood of being attributed to a foreign actor or an influence operation, my ability to pull down the network to see who else they're engaging with or where else it is now hampered by the fact that I go through that process where I literally have to sit there and type in somebody's followers. But at the same time, if you tell somebody your followers are public and I'm going to pull them down into a spreadsheet, a lot of people would find that really creepy. And so the sort of the question of how do we make people, there's always evolutions in our thinking about extremely thorny conceptual topics, particularly I would say the privacy security balance. Ring doorbell is an excellent example of this, right? There have always been security cameras. Is the problem that Ring is a camera, or is the problem that Ring offers this social sharing tool in addition to it? Is it just that our sense of where we are, where we stand in the world is different? You might have followed, I think a lot of us are from San Francisco, the facial recognition bill, the ordinance that passed here. If you actually went and looked at what they reclassified as surveillance technology, it included license plate readers and audio gunshot detectors, because the audio gunshot detector records about 2 seconds of sound when it is in the process of turning on to alert the police or whomever that a gunshot has happened. And so that is now classified as a surveillance technology, which I think is interesting because that technology 5 years ago was really seen as a boon in improving response time. And is that 2 seconds of captured audio a violation of the privacy rights of people who may have been around, even though in most of those cases it's recording content, audio content on a public street? And so the ideas of like, where are we in the ways that we think about our spaces, our engagement online, what we're communicating and to whom, it does wind up becoming a really interesting question of like balancing equities. So privacy and security, interesting trade-offs there. Transparency and accountability, what I think we're all trying to go for, trying to get to, and the question is more how. And ending on a positive, uplifting note. I'll be honest, I'm not naturally an optimistic person, but I mean, I think there's regulation is being passed in Europe and elsewhere. There's a lot of debates about whether we want the kind of regulation that we're getting in Europe, or that Singapore has a remarkable law that just passed related to takedowns and the government's ability to take down fake news. I think some of this stuff is going to be interesting to see, like what other countries actually pass, and then what the experiments from the kind of how those regulations play out in the real world as a way to inform what's working and what's not. But it is definitely interesting to think about global information ecosystems and how on earth we regulate them, particularly in the context of ensuring information integrity and addressing problems like disinformation. So,
Hi. So you mentioned earlier with media literacy that other countries were doing educational programs of how to recognize propaganda. Was there any specific examples that you had about how they did that? Like, would it be in classrooms or workshops?
Classrooms, workshops, and here's the thing that I didn't get too deep into. Other countries have much higher degrees of trust in media and government than ours does. And that, I think, is the key problem with media literacy programs. That is why I think actually this media literacy approach of kind of moving down into the local environment where there's at least a degree of trust in your local ecosystem. Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania all have a lot of programs. A lot of them dealt with Russian propaganda for decades, and so they recognize that propaganda has moved online, but propaganda is not a different thing, and so they're retaining some of that kind of core, here's how you understand information designed to be inflammatory in the age of the internet, which I think is actually a very solid way to do it. In the US, we devolved down into conversations around well, CNN is propaganda, well, Fox is propaganda, well, and nobody trusts the government, and nobody trusts the media ecosystem that isn't there. So that's where I think it'll be interesting to see how these things play out. I think helping people understand that what they see on the internet is not always what it seems is maybe a start. Again, I came of age during America Online, so I don't know who doesn't know that, but it is it's an interesting problem.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I'm a big fan of your work. I've had the pleasure of doing a little bit of work in this area. We'll be going on to do more work, and have had the privilege of talking to people at a number of the platforms recently about this. And one thing I've kind of pressed on a bit is the ability of companies to work together, and you talked a little bit about that. And something I heard a couple of times, a couple of things, like one, companies being afraid of going and looking for activity, including foreign state activity, opens them up to legal risk. Another argument I heard was that if we work with other companies, we'll be accused of collusion and that's a legal risk.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if those are good faith concerns, and then if they are, is there a way for companies to have legal cover to work together on this?
Yeah, we're thinking a lot about that. So the Africa work that Rachel alluded to, which is up on Stanford Internet Observatory's website, the way that played out, one of my team members found a page targeting Libya. And we believed it to be fake, and then we found a network of 9 pages, and then we took that network and we went to Facebook with it, actually. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I personally don't believe that just shaming companies with like, you have bots, you have this, you have that, is a productive way to move forward. And the other thing is, we only have visibility into the public-facing stuff, so we can see content, voice, and dissemination, but when it comes to looking at the voice on a really deep level, like IP addresses, email addresses, shared administration of pages, like a number of things that Facebook can see that we can't see, the way to find the rest of the operation, actually, is to share the information to the company. And what they came to us with was, this is very interesting, and this plays into an investigation that we have going in a different country, and we believe that these two entities are related. And so then it became, okay, what can they share back with us? And the interesting thing is, there's certain things that they were able to share, and then there are certain things that, under particular privacy constraints, they can't share back with us. And so the question becomes, even when I was given the Senate data set for Russia, Twitter did provide email addresses and IP addresses, which means that I saw those too. That kind of stuff would never be put out publicly, but the question, it is really hard to make an attribution on this stuff, and so the question becomes, can we create a system of, trusted information sharing partners where we are all working together to arrive at that concrete attribution? The GRU stuff that I put out this week also, I called Bellingcat, I called DFR Lab. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I called where I was like, really think this guy is fake, disprove it. Like, help me figure out a way in which I am wrong here, because I don't want to be, if I am wrong publicly, I have a lot of problems. If we go through this process now, where we can all come to an understanding of like why we think this entity is adjacent to this operation, then we put out something that stands up to scrutiny. And so there was a checking in with Twitter, checking in with Facebook. And then the press reported that out as, you gave this to Twitter and they should have had it sooner. And so it is always like I'm really trying so hard to get past that. There are a lot of things to criticize, like you had a Twitter account up that belonged to GRU is not, in my opinion, the most productive one. So we're trying to find what are the ways that we can do this. ISACs, like the Information Sharing Advisory Centers, they exist in a number of different industries, and the entire point is so that people can share information back and forth. Most of that has been traditional cybersecurity threats, so not information operations, but literally like, we got hacked by this guy, right? Or this is an interesting spear phishing campaign that we've seen targeting our workers, you guys should also be aware of it. So how can we create that kind of productive process in influence operations, recognizing that they're not wrong when they say this. I mean, of course, their incentive is not to be regulated, but there are ways I think that we can come up with more persistent frameworks to do this effectively. And yeah, and there was some information that they can't share back with us, and that's just, just the way it goes. But let me tell you, when you put out an attribution, like, you are immediately attacked, and the immediate goal is to discredit the person who has put out the attribution, because if you can do that, the attribution is discredited by association. So almost everybody who does this kind of work at this point is actively soliciting feedback from colleagues, from the platforms, and from wherever you can get it before putting it out.
Hi. What do you think is the biggest barrier to developing better visualization of activity on the internet? We have great hurricane maps, but we don't have anything that gives us high-level instrumentation of what people are talking about, or that particular trends are blowing up on a particular platform.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I used to work at a company that did look at what's called anomaly detection and signals. Couple things. One, the volume is vast. Two, a lot of the interesting stuff takes place in closed spaces. So there have been, Brandwatch and Trendwatch, Trendalizer kind of software for social listening is the type of, it's like a SaaS product usually. Brands will buy it. It tells Nike that 500 people just mentioned them in the last 30 minutes, right? Or that one URL of theirs is going viral. It doesn't tell them if the people are real. It doesn't tell them, like, there's a lot of things it doesn't tell them. So there are a couple of companies that are working on producing tools to solve that problem. As far as like freely accessible stuff, there's a tool called Hoaxy out of University of Indiana, and it actually does do a visualization, and it does it over time, so you can see who tweeted it first, and then all of the little accounts go nuts. I was out at an event, so I didn't have access to my stuff, and I got this interesting inquiry about Evo Morales and the Bolivia situation. Somebody wanting to understand where a message came from, and you can kind of go to Hoaxy, and you'll see at least you can kind of like watch it play out in real time. Where it isn't always as great is that people still, for some reason, want to know if the accounts are bots, and the bot classifiers are not very good. A lot of them are really trained on activity in like 2015, and like I said, the stuff doesn't look the same way. And then there's also the matter that like Twitter has, so another example of like self-regulation, so to speak, stuff used to trend all the time, and that the Seth Rich example I gave and a couple of the others, Twitter eventually created this concept of a low-quality account, and those accounts are underweighted when it's calculating trending. So if you are a purely automated account or an account that was created yesterday and has only tweeted about this hashtag, it's not going to weigh that into the calculation for what it takes to make something trend, particularly at a national level. That's not something that was passed through regulation. That was largely passed by a lot of public opinion, sort of, and articles and other things written to nudge that in a particular direction. And there's a high likelihood that eventually other ways to get around that will be found, and then they'll have to rethink it again. There's also the problem that now that people know that there is such a thing as a low-quality account, you see people screaming that they're shadow banned and getting gray boxed and this and that, and that their voices are being censored because they're not up at the top of people's feeds. So even the solutions rapidly get politicized, even when they come through just sort of technological tweaks. So it's definitely an interesting place to be doing work.
I wanted to ask, since it seems like there's not going to be anything passed by the U.S. government regarding foreign interference in social media for elections for this coming cycle, like how big a problem that will be? Like, I don't know if, like, I don't think they're like concrete estimates, right? I don't know if you would quantify it, but like even just like your personal qualitative sense as a researcher about how big that problem is.
I think the platforms are just in a much better position than they were in 2016 when nobody looked at it. The outside, like I said, the outside researcher platform collaboration is, we had none in 2016, some in 2018, and now actually quite a lot in 2020. I have an op-ed out in WAPO today with Alex and with Ambassador Mike McFall actually saying that in some ways we have done a lot more to harden against the social influence side of things than the actual hack and leak piece. And that's because the hack and leak was, I think, the far bigger story in terms of like what really reached people's kind of consciousness. And so there's a question to ask also about how will the next hack and leak be covered, because there will be another hack and leak, right? This is, I think that I would say is a really significant challenge is how the next hack and leak will be covered. And then on the social influence stuff, what we found with the Africa study, the Africa report, was that they had franchised the campaigns to locals. This was actually really interesting. So they ran, so it's 8 countries in Africa, 83 pages. You can read the report, about 1.7 million followers or so. What they did was they hired people. They put up job ads. So write for the Khartoum Star, write for the, they create front media organizations, and then they have real people write for them. And so the real people are writing aligned content. It's unclear to what extent they know who they're writing for or what they're doing. The GRU used to just make fake people, but with the fake people piece, like, we all sit there running down, like, does this person exist? Like, they're not on the voter rolls, their profile picture is stolen. Like, what are the odds that this person actually exists? What they did with the latest iteration, the stuff that literally came down 2 weeks ago, was they just hired real people. And so that is a significant problem, right? And so when you look at US 2020, there are plenty of people who are either going to write hyperpartisan content. They won't necessarily have front organizations here because this is a thing that we are aware of now that we look for. But what they'll do is they'll work to amplify hyperpartisan content. So it'll be much more of a distribution detection, I think, game than anything else. They also know that if a trend is in any way, if Twitter sees a trend, decides that it's malign and deprecates it, then there's a whole new story you can create about how Twitter censored you, right? And so there's it just becomes like a, it's really interesting when we think about how we're gonna do this. Yeah, like how we're gonna think about preserving freedom of expression, ensuring that people's tweets and things are seen, and then also recognizing that this is going to be kind of a front for 2020. So, thanks.